In 1842, a German Egyptologist named Karl Richard Lepsius made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about death, consciousness, and the afterlife. Deep within the burial chambers of Theban tombs, he found something that the Egyptian priests had kept hidden for over 3,000 years. Something so powerful, so dangerous, that its very existence was concealed from common people during ancient times. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. But history would know it by a far more ominous name, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But here's what they don't tell you in museums and textbooks. This wasn't just a collection of prayers or religious poetry. According to the ancient Egyptians themselves, this was an actual instruction manual. A step-by-step guide to navigate a terrifying journey that every human soul must face. And the most disturbing part? Modern quantum physics is discovering phenomena that eerily mirror what these ancient texts described over 3,500 years ago. What did the Egyptian priests really know? Why were these texts so closely guarded? And what are mainstream scientists refusing to tell us about the content of these ancient spells? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt, human consciousness, and perhaps even about what awaits us all after we take our final breath. Walk into any major museum with Egyptian collections. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You'll see the Book of the Dead displayed prominently. Beautiful papyrus scrolls covered in intricate hieroglyphs and colourful illustrations. Tour guides will tell you these are funeral texts or religious hymns. Ancient poetry meant to comfort the deceased. But that's not the whole story, not even close. Here's what they don't emphasize. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single book at all. It was a collection of nearly 200 distinct spells, each one carefully crafted for a specific purpose. And these weren't metaphorical or symbolic. The ancient Egyptians believed with absolute certainty that these spells had real, tangible power. Power to transform the deceased into gods. Power to command supernatural entities. Power to literally reshape reality itself in the realm of the dead. The official name the Egyptians used tells us everything. Reunu Pertem Hru, the spells for coming forth by day. Not prayers, not hymns, spells. Magical incantations that the deceased would need to speak at precise moments during their journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Now, before you dismiss this as primitive superstition, consider this. These texts were so valuable that only the wealthy elite could afford complete copies. A full Book of the Dead papyrus could cost the equivalent of several years' wages for a common worker. Why would the ancient Egyptians invest such enormous resources into creating these texts if they were merely symbolic? Why did families literally bankrupt themselves to ensure their loved ones were buried with these spells? The answer is simple and terrifying. They believed that without these specific instructions, the soul would be destroyed. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, actually permanently annihilated in the underworld. Dr. Ogden Goelet, a professor of Egyptian language at New York University, has studied these texts for over 40 years. In his translation work, he makes a startling observation that most mainstream sources quietly ignore. The spells in the Book of the Dead contain precise, technical language. They read less like poetry and more like an engineer's manual. Specific words had to be pronounced in specific ways. Certain spells could only be recited while facing specific directions. Some required physical actions to be performed simultaneously. The level of detail is extraordinary. Spell 125, perhaps the most famous, doesn't just describe the weighing of the heart ceremony. It provides the exact words the deceased must speak to each of the 42 divine judges. Get one wrong, mispronounce a single name, and according to the text, your heart would be judged impure and fed to Amit, the devourer of the dead. This wasn't general guidance. This was specific, technical instruction for navigating actual, real dangers that the Egyptians believed existed in the afterlife. And here's where it gets really interesting. These texts evolved over time, but not in the way you'd expect from mythology or religious poetry. They became more precise, more detailed, more technical. The oldest versions, the pyramid texts from around 2400 BCE, are relatively simple. But by the time we get to the New Kingdom versions around 1500 BCE, the texts have become incredibly sophisticated. New spells were added. Existing spells were refined. Instructions became more specific. This is the opposite of how myths typically evolve. Myths generally become simpler and more symbolic over time. But the Book of the Dead became more complex, as if the Egyptians were actually learning more about the territory these texts were meant to navigate. Dr. John Taylor, curator of the British Museum's Egyptian collection, has noted something peculiar. Many of the spells contain what he calls insider knowledge, references to locations, entities, and obstacles that don't appear in mainstream Egyptian mythology. They're mentioned matter-of-factly, as if the reader already knows what they are. It's like finding a survival guide for a place that officially doesn't exist, written by people who seem to have actually been there. So what exactly did these texts contain? What knowledge was so crucial that Egypt's elite spent fortunes to be buried with it? And why do mainstream academics seem so uncomfortable discussing what these spells actually claim to do? The answers are far stranger than you might imagine. Let's talk about what these spells actually say. Because once you read the translations, you realize why museums and textbooks tend to gloss over the specifics. These aren't gentle prayers asking gods for mercy. These are commands, declarations of power. And in many cases, they're instructions for the deceased to literally transform themselves into gods. Take spell 15, one of the earlier spells in most papyri. It's often described as a hymn to Ra, the sun god. And yes, it does praise Ra. But read the full text, and you discover something remarkable. The deceased isn't asking Ra for help. The deceased is claiming to be Ra. The spell states, "I am Ra at his first appearance. I am the great god who came into being by himself." This isn't metaphorical language. The spell is teaching the deceased to literally assume the identity of the sun god. And this pattern repeats throughout the Book of the Dead. The deceased becomes Osiris, becomes Horus, becomes Thoth, becomes any god necessary for the situation at hand. Why? Because in the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife, identity was fluid. Reality itself was malleable. And if you knew the right words, the right names, the right spells, you could reshape both reality and yourself. But it gets stranger. Some spells aren't about assuming divine identities. They're about preventing transformation. Negative transformation. Spell 76 is titled Spell for Assuming Any Form One Wishes. Sounds empowering, right? But spell 77 through 88 are all variations of Spell for Not Letting the Deceased Transform into Various Things. Not letting the deceased transform into a snake, into a crocodile, into various other creatures. The texts describe these transformations as genuine threats. The implication is clear. In the afterlife, without the right knowledge, you might lose your human form entirely. Dr. Raymond Faulkner, one of the most respected translators of the Book of the Dead, noted that these transformation spells follow a specific pattern. They all include a phrase that roughly translates to, "I know the words of power that prevent this." Knowledge was literally power in the Egyptian afterlife. Knowing the right words could save you from annihilation. Not knowing them could doom you to become something less than human. But perhaps the most disturbing spells are the ones that describe the actual geography of the Duat, the underworld. Spell 144 through 147 describe the 7 gates that the deceased must pass through. Each gate is guarded by 3 entities, a guardian, a herald, and a door itself that can speak. Each requires specific knowledge to pass. The deceased must know the name of each guardian, the name of each herald, and the name of each door. Get any of them wrong, and passage is denied. Now, here's what's fascinating. These names aren't simple or obvious. They're strange, often seemingly nonsensical combinations of words. Names like inverted of face, numerous of forms, or loud of voice, repeller of crocodiles, who brings the one who serves him. Why such complex names? If these were just stories, wouldn't simpler, more memorable names make more sense? Unless, of course, the complexity served a purpose. Unless these were actual identifiers that needed to be precise. It's like finding a list of network passwords written in an ancient text. Randomly generated strings of characters that only make sense if they're meant to authenticate legitimate users. Then there's spell 125, the famous weighing of the heart ceremony. Everyone knows the basic story. The deceased's heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. If the heart is heavy with sin, it's devoured by Amit. But the spell itself reveals something that most people never hear about. The deceased must recite a negative confession to 42 different divine judges. Each judge must be addressed by name, and for each one, the deceased must deny committing specific offences. O wide strider who comes from Heliopolis, I have not done evil. O fire embracer who comes from Keraha, I have not stolen. O nosy who comes from Hermopolis, I have not been covetous. And on, through 42 specific denials to 42 specific judges, from 42 specific locations. Now, what's interesting is that scholars have discovered that these 42 judges correspond roughly to the 42 nomes, or administrative districts, of ancient Egypt. It's as if the afterlife was organized like the living world. with representatives from each district. But here's the really strange part. The negative confession includes denials of acts that weren't necessarily considered sins in ancient Egypt. Things like, "I have not stopped the flow of water," or "I have not driven away the cattle from their pastures." These are oddly specific prohibitions. Why these particular acts? Unless they had significance in the afterlife that we don't understand. Dr. Jan Assmann, a German Egyptologist, has proposed that the negative confession represents an actual ethical system that governed the afterlife. Not the moral code of the living world, but a different set of rules that applied specifically to the realm of the dead. In other words, the rules changed after death. Different laws applied, different behaviors mattered. And the Book of the Dead was teaching the deceased what those rules were. But perhaps the most powerful spells in the entire collection are the ones that claim to give the deceased power over the gods themselves. Spell 9 states, "I am the jackal of jackals. I am Shu, who draws up air. I am the one who seizes with his hand. I am imperishable. I am eternal." This isn't asking for divine favor. This is claiming divine authority. Spell 42 goes even further. "My mouth is opened by Ptah. The fetters on my mouth are loosened by my local god." Thoth comes fully equipped with spells and loosens the fetters on my mouth. The deceased is describing being given the power of divine speech, the ability to command reality itself through words. And this brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Book of the Dead, an aspect that most mainstream Egyptologists are deeply uncomfortable discussing. These texts don't just describe the afterlife, they provide techniques for manipulating it, for bending the rules, for, in essence, hacking the system. The ancient Egyptians believed that reality, both in life and after death, operated according to specific laws. Laws that could be understood. Laws that, with the right knowledge, could be influenced or even overridden. The Book of the Dead wasn't just a map of the afterlife. It was a toolkit for navigating, surviving, and ultimately conquering death itself. And that raises a question that makes scholars deeply uncomfortable. What if the Egyptians were right? Not metaphorically, actually right. What if consciousness does continue after death? What if there are territories that consciousness encounters? What if the Book of the Dead is actually describing a real place that the ancient Egyptians somehow had knowledge of? Before you dismiss this as impossible, let me share something that will absolutely blow your mind. Modern physics has made some discoveries in the last few decades that would have been considered completely impossible 50 years ago. Discoveries about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the relationship between the two that would have gotten you laughed out of any serious scientific institution. But now, these are established facts, proven experimentally, replicated in laboratories around the world. And here's what's disturbing. Some of these discoveries mirror concepts that appear in the Egyptian Book of the Dead with eerie precision. Let's start with the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Experiments have proven beyond any doubt that the act of observation affects the behavior of subatomic particles. Before they're observed, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously, what physicists call superposition. But the moment they're observed, they collapse into a single, definite state. In other words, consciousness directly affects physical reality at the quantum level. Now, listen to what spell 130 from the Book of the Dead says. I am he who knows the place where Ra rises, who knows the place where he sets. I witness his manifestation. I speak, and he comes into being. The deceased claims that their knowledge, their conscious awareness, literally brings Ra into existence. Observation creates reality. Coincidence? Maybe. But it gets weirder. Modern neuroscience has discovered that memory isn't stored in specific locations in the brain like files on a hard drive. Instead, memories appear to be distributed across neural networks in a holographic pattern. Damage to parts of the brain diminishes memory quality, but doesn't erase specific memories entirely. Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, proposed the holonomic brain theory, that reality itself might be holographic, that consciousness might be able to access information that isn't locally present. This is cutting-edge science. But listen to what the Book of the Dead describes. Spell 64 is titled Spell for Knowing the Spells in a Single Spell. It claims that by knowing this one spell, the deceased gains access to all the other spells, not by memorization, but by some kind of direct connection to the complete knowledge. The text states, "He knows everything that concerns the affairs of the Duat. All that which the gods decree shall be disclosed to him. He shall become a god like them." It's describing instantaneous access to complete information. A holographic model of knowledge where knowing one part gives you access to the whole. But perhaps the most startling parallel involves the concept of quantum entanglement. Entanglement is one of the weirdest phenomena in physics. When two particles become entangled, they remain connected regardless of the distance between them. Measuring the state of one particle instantly affects the state of the other, even if they're on opposite sides of the universe. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance and believed it proved that quantum mechanics was incomplete. He was wrong. Entanglement is real, and experiments have confirmed it conclusively. Now, consider what the Book of the Dead says about names and identity. The Egyptians believed that a person's name, their Ren, was a fundamental part of their being. Knowing someone's true name gave you power over them. Saying someone's name kept them alive in the afterlife. Erasing someone's name from monuments was the ultimate curse, removing them from existence entirely. Why would names have such power? Unless names represented a kind of entanglement. A connection between the symbol and the thing symbolized that transcended normal causation. Dr. Leonard Lesko, a professor of Egyptology at Brown University, has noted that the Egyptian concept of names goes far beyond what we typically think of as identity. Names were seen as actual connections to the essence of things. Knowing a name meant having a link to the thing named. It's remarkably similar to how quantum entanglement creates persistent connections between particles. But let me share the most disturbing parallel of all. And this one, I promise you, will keep you up at night. Modern physics has discovered that information cannot be destroyed. This is a fundamental law called the conservation of quantum information. Even when something is destroyed at the physical level, the information that described its quantum state must continue to exist somewhere in the universe. This leads to a profound implication. If information cannot be destroyed, then the information pattern that represents your consciousness, your memories, your identity, must persist after death. It has to. The laws of physics require it. But where does that information go? What happens to it? Modern physics doesn't have an answer. Not yet. But the Book of the Dead does. The Duat, according to Egyptian texts, is where consciousness goes after death. But it's not a physical place in the way we think of location. The texts describe it as existing alongside our world, accessible through specific thresholds, but operating under different laws. Sounds familiar? It should, because that's almost exactly how physicists describe the quantum realm. A level of reality that exists alongside our classical world, accessible under certain conditions, operating under rules that seem bizarre from our everyday perspective. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose, a physicist at Oxford, have proposed a controversial theory called orchestrated objective reduction. They suggest that consciousness arises from quantum processes in brain microtubules, and that after death, this quantum information doesn't disappear. It returns to the universal quantum field. When I first read their papers and then compared them to the Egyptian texts, I experienced genuine chills. Because what they're describing, this persistence of conscious information in a quantum field, is remarkably similar to what the Book of the Dead describes as the soul's journey through the Duat. Now, I'm not saying that modern physics proves the Book of the Dead is literally true. That would be a massive overreach. But I am saying this. The ancient Egyptians described concepts about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence that modern science is only now beginning to grapple with. And they did it 3,500 years ago. How? How could they possibly have known about things that required advanced technology to discover? Unless they had a different kind of technology. One we've lost. One that mainstream science refuses to seriously consider. But before we go there, we need to talk about the most controversial secret in the Book of the Dead. The one thing that Egyptologists almost never discuss publicly. The texts describe death not as an ending, but as a transformation. Not as a journey to a different place, but as a shift to a different state of consciousness. And the most disturbing implication is that this shift might be something we can prepare for, something we can practice. The ancient Egyptian priests might have developed actual techniques for exploring the afterlife while still alive, and some evidence suggests they succeeded. Here's something that will change your entire understanding of ancient Egypt. The priests didn't just read the Book of the Dead to prepare others for death. They performed rituals designed to actually experience the afterlife journey while still alive. This isn't speculation. The evidence is in the texts themselves, in the architecture of temples, and in the accounts written by Greek and Roman visitors to Egypt. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, wrote about Egyptian priests who would undergo what he called sacred initiations in underground chambers. He wasn't allowed to witness these rituals directly, but those who emerged spoke of journeying to the realm of the dead and returning changed. Plutarch, writing several centuries later, described Egyptian mystery rites that involve the initiate experiencing their own death and rebirth. He wrote, "The soul at the point of death has the same experience as those who are being initiated into great mysteries." For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Mystery cults were common in the ancient world. Every culture had their dramatic initiation ceremonies. Nothing unusual. But then archaeologists started finding the chambers. Beneath the Serapeum at Saqqara, massive underground galleries with enormous stone sarcophagi. In the Temple of Seti, the first at Abydos, a mysterious structure called the Osirion, with chambers that appeared designed for ritual submersion. At Dendera, underground crypts with channels that could be filled with water. And the common element? They all appear to have been designed to recreate the conditions described in the Book of the Dead. Darkness, confinement, sensory deprivation, water representing the primordial ocean of none. Dr. Rosemary Clark, an Egyptologist who has extensively studied Egyptian temple practices, makes a controversial argument. These weren't just symbolic spaces. They were functional technology designed to induce specific, altered states of consciousness. The chambers had precise acoustics that would amplify sound in strange ways. The granite sarcophagi, when struck, produce resonant frequencies that modern sound engineers find remarkably pure. The darkness would be absolute, the kind of darkness you can never experience on the surface. Now, modern neuroscience has discovered something fascinating. Under conditions of extreme sensory deprivation, the human brain doesn't just relax, it actively generates experiences, hallucinations, visions. And remarkably, these experiences follow consistent patterns across different people. Dr. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico, conducted studies where he administered DMT, a powerful psychedelic compound, to volunteers. DMT is fascinating because it's produced naturally in the human brain, particularly at times of extreme stress, like during near-death experiences. What Strassman found was shocking. His test subjects, who came from different backgrounds and had no knowledge of ancient Egyptian religion, consistently described experiences that matched the Egyptian texts. They described traveling through darkness, encountering guardian entities, being judged, experiencing transformation. One subject specifically described an experience that matched spell 175 of the Book of the Dead almost exactly. Being in a place of total darkness, then seeing a distant light, traveling toward it through a narrow passage, and emerging into a place where the laws were different. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you dig into what the Book of the Dead actually prescribes, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Spell 137 through 139 are known as the torch spells. They describe the deceased needing to light their way through absolute darkness. But these aren't just metaphorical torches. The spells provide specific instructions for physical torches that must be prepared in particular ways. One requires a torch made from a specific type of cloth, soaked in specific oils, lit in a specific manner. The instructions are precise, technical, almost like a recipe. Why such detail for something symbolic? Unless these torches were actually used in living rituals, unless priests were actually navigating real darkness, and the quality of their light source actually mattered. But it's spell 64 that really reveals what the priests were doing. Spell 64 is the longest and most complex spell in the Book of the Dead. It's titled Spell for Knowing the Spells in a Single Spell. And buried in its text is a passage that scholars rarely emphasize. This spell is to be recited over a drawing made on clean papyrus in genuine cedar oil. The man for whom this is done must be pure and clean, must not eat animal flesh, must not approach women. Incense shall be offered when Ra appears over the horizon. These aren't instructions for the dead. These are instructions for living practitioners. It describes a ritual of purification, a specific time of day, and precise materials to be used. This same pattern appears throughout the Book of the Dead. Many spells include postscripts that begin with beneficial on earth as in the duat, or spell proven effective by millions since ancient times. These spells were being used by living people, and they were being refined based on results. This wasn't just religious scripture. This was an active manual for techniques that priests were actually practicing. Dr. Jeremy Nadler, a philosopher who has studied Egyptian spirituality, argues that the mystery of the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples can only be understood if we recognize that the Egyptians were engaged in a sophisticated program of consciousness exploration. The architecture wasn't just impressive, it was functional. The spaces were designed to facilitate specific experiences. The texts preserve knowledge gained from those experiences. But here's where it gets really controversial. If the Egyptian priests were successfully inducing near-death-like states, journeying to other realms of consciousness, what did they find there? Because the Book of the Dead doesn't just describe obstacles and dangers, it describes entities, beings that exist in these other realms, beings with intelligence, purpose, and power. Mainstream Egyptology treats these as purely mythological, gods and demons that existed only in the Egyptian imagination. But what if they weren't imaginary? What if these entities were something the priests actually encountered during their consciousness explorations? What if the Book of the Dead is actually a field guide to real beings that exist in dimensions of reality we haven't yet learned to access? The texts themselves suggest this is the case. The entities are described with too much specificity, too much detail, too much personality. Anubis isn't just a jackal-headed god. He's described as having specific mannerisms, specific ways of speaking, specific knowledge he possesses, and specific knowledge he lacks. The texts describe how to appeal to him, what moves him, what doesn't. It reads less like mythology and more like an intelligence report, as if these entities were observed, studied, and documented by people who had genuine interactions with them. And then there are the negative confessions from spell 125. Remember those? The 42 denials the deceased must make before the 42 judges. Dr. Eric Hornung, one of the world's foremost experts on Egyptian afterlife beliefs, points out something strange about these confessions. Many of them don't correspond to Egyptian moral codes. Some describe acts that weren't considered wrong in ancient Egypt. Some describe things that would be virtually impossible to do. I have not built a dam against flowing water. I have not driven away cattle from their pastures. I have not disturbed the times and seasons. These aren't the kinds of things you'd make up for a purely symbolic ritual. They're oddly specific, almost as if they address actual concerns of actual judges who actually care about these particular things. It's like finding a customs declaration form for entering a country that officially doesn't exist. Why would you create such specific documentation unless the border crossing was real? But the most compelling evidence that priests were actually practicing these techniques comes from an unexpected source: the bodies themselves. Modern medical imaging has revealed something extraordinary about certain elite Egyptian mummies. Not all of them, but a specific subset. The brains of certain high-ranking priests show structural differences from normal Egyptian mummies. Dr. Bob Breyer, a renowned mummy expert, has studied thousands of Egyptian remains. In some priestly mummies, he's found evidence of what he calls deliberate alterations to brain structure. Not damage. Alterations that appear to have been induced during life. The pineal gland, a small structure in the center of the brain that produces DMT and regulates consciousness, shows unusual development in some of these mummies. It's enlarged, calcified in specific patterns. Now, this could be natural variation, or it could be evidence that these priests were engaging in practices that physically altered their brains over time. Practices designed to enhance their ability to access altered states of consciousness. Meditation, sensory deprivation, certain breathing techniques, exposure to specific acoustic frequencies. Modern research has shown that all of these can produce measurable, lasting changes in brain structure. What if the Egyptian priests had developed their own versions of these techniques? What if they were systematically training their consciousness to navigate the realms described in the Book of the Dead? And what if they succeeded? Because there's one more piece of evidence that suggests the priests had knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. Knowledge that some scientists are working very hard to explain away. The timing. The Book of the Dead isn't just about spiritual practices and moral codes. Hidden throughout its spells are references to astronomical phenomena with a level of precision that shouldn't have been possible. Let me show you what I mean. Spell 17 is one of the longest and most complex spells in the entire collection. It's often called the spell of coming forth by day. And embedded in its text are descriptions of celestial events that scholars have struggled to explain. The spell mentions specific star patterns. It describes the rising of certain constellations in relation to others. And when you calculate backwards using modern astronomical software, you find that these descriptions only match the actual sky during very specific time periods. Dr. Virginia Trimble, an astronomer at UC Irvine, has studied the astronomical content of Egyptian funerary texts. She's made a startling discovery. Some of the stellar positions described in the Book of the Dead only align correctly with dates going back to around 10,500 BCE. Wait, 10,500 BCE. The Book of the Dead is supposed to date from around 1500 BCE at the earliest. How could it describe stellar positions from 9,000 years earlier? The standard explanation is that the Egyptians were preserving much older astronomical observations, that they had inherited knowledge from a previous, unknown civilization. But there's another possibility, one that makes mainstream Egyptologists extremely uncomfortable. The stellar positions described aren't random. They align with a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top, completing one full cycle every 25,920 years. This causes the position of stars relative to the horizon to shift very slowly over time. The Egyptians, according to conventional history, didn't know about precession. That knowledge supposedly comes from the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, around 150 BCE. But the Book of the Dead contains references to stellar cycles that only make sense if you understand precession. Spell 17 specifically mentions the recurrence of stellar positions, as if the sky repeats in vast cycles. How could Bronze Age priests know about an astronomical phenomenon that requires thousands of years of careful observation to detect? Unless they inherited records from a much older civilization, one that had been observing the sky for the necessary time span, or unless their consciousness exploration techniques gave them access to information in ways we don't yet understand. But the astronomical knowledge goes deeper, much deeper. The Book of the Dead makes frequent references to Sa, which we now know corresponds to the Orion constellation. But it doesn't just mention Orion. It describes specific stars within Orion and their relationship to other stellar features. Robert Bauval, the engineer who proposed the Orion correlation theory, has shown that the three main pyramids of Giza align with remarkable precision to the three stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in 10,500 BCE. This correlation has been controversial, but the mathematical alignment is undeniable. The question is why? Why would the Egyptians align their greatest monuments to stars as they appeared thousands of years before the pyramids were built? The Book of the Dead might provide the answer. Spell 15 states, "I am Orion, Lord of the Circuit, who came forth from Sahu, Lord of Years, Lord of Eternity." The deceased claims to be Orion, but not just present-day Orion. Lord of the Circuit suggests the full precessional cycle, the complete 26,000-year journey of the stars. It's as if the Egyptians understood that they were part of a vast cycle of time, that their civilization was one point in a much longer story, and that the true significance of their knowledge could only be understood by looking at time scales measured in tens of thousands of years. But here's the really mind-bending part. Modern physics is discovering that time itself might not work the way we think it does. Einstein's relativity proved that time is not absolute. It flows at different rates depending on gravity and velocity. Quantum mechanics has shown that at subatomic scales, causality itself becomes fuzzy. Some quantum phenomena seem to work backwards in time. In 2022, a team of physicists at Imperial College London published a paper demonstrating quantum entanglement between events that aren't connected by normal cause and effect. They called it quantum time order. What if consciousness, existing at the quantum level according to theories like orchestrated objective reduction, can access information outside of linear time? What if the Egyptian priests, through their consciousness exploration techniques, could perceive past and future simultaneously. It sounds like science fiction, but it's increasingly consistent with cutting-edge quantum physics. And it would explain how the Book of the Dead contains knowledge that shouldn't have been accessible to Bronze Age priests. But there's one more astronomical secret in the Book of the Dead that will absolutely blow your mind. One that mainstream science discovered only in the last few decades, and one that the Egyptians somehow knew about 3,500 years ago. Spell 130 describes the journey of the soul through the heavens. It mentions passing through specific regions, encountering specific obstacles, and finally reaching a place called the Field of Reeds, where the righteous dead live forever. Egyptologists have long assumed this was purely mythological, a heaven-like paradise invented to comfort mourners. But in 2003, Dr. Juan Belmonte, an archaeoastronomer at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, made a startling discovery. He was analyzing the astronomical alignments of Egyptian temples when he realized that the journey described in Spell 130 precisely matches the path of the Milky Way galaxy as visible from Egypt. The obstacles described in the spell? They correspond to dark nebulae that obscure parts of the Milky Way. The Field of Reeds? It matches the location of the galactic center, where the density of stars is highest. But here's what's impossible. The Egyptians described this journey as if they understood that the Milky Way is a galaxy, a vast collection of stars that forms a disc-shaped structure. And they placed their eternal paradise at what we now know is the galactic center. How could they possibly have known this? You can't see galactic structure from Earth without powerful telescopes. The Milky Way just looks like a bright band across the sky. There's no way to determine its shape or to locate its center just by looking at it. Yet somehow, the Egyptian priests encoded this knowledge into their funerary texts. They described a cosmology that wouldn't be confirmed by modern astronomy until the 20th century. Either they inherited this knowledge from an advanced predecessor civilization, or their consciousness exploration techniques gave them access to information that transcended normal sensory limitations. Or there's a third possibility, one that almost no one wants to consider. What if the entities described in the Book of the Dead are real? What if the priests actually encountered non-human intelligences during their consciousness journeys? And what if these entities provided information about the structure of the cosmos? Before you dismiss this as ancient aliens nonsense, consider this. Modern scientists who have explored altered states of consciousness through legal clinical research consistently report encountering entities, beings that appear to have independent existence and knowledge. Dr. Andrew Gallimore, a neuroscientist, has studied DMT experiences extensively. He notes that subjects frequently report receiving information from entities encountered during DMT journeys. Information they couldn't have known beforehand. In several documented cases, subjects have provided technical information about chemistry, mathematics, or physics that they didn't have the education to understand. Information that, when checked by experts, turned out to be correct. If modern people undergoing induced altered states can encounter entities that provide accurate information, why couldn't ancient Egyptian priests have had similar experiences? And why couldn't the Book of the Dead be a compilation of knowledge gained from thousands of such encounters over centuries. I know how crazy that sounds, but the evidence forces us to at least consider it as a possibility. Because there's one more secret buried in the Book of the Dead. One that reveals something about the Egyptian understanding of reality that modern physics is only now beginning to grasp. And it suggests that the boundary between life and death might not be as absolute as we think. In 1957, physicist Hugh Everett proposed something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The idea is simple but mind-breaking. Every time a quantum event can go multiple ways, reality splits. All possibilities happen, just in different branches of reality. Most physicists dismissed this as philosophical speculation. But in recent decades, the mathematics has become increasingly compelling. Some of the brightest minds in physics now accept many worlds as the best explanation for quantum phenomena. What does this have to do with ancient Egypt? Everything. Because the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife wasn't a single fixed place. It was a realm of possibilities. A place where reality itself was fluid, shaped by knowledge, intent, and will. Spell 64 states, "I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I have the power to be born a second time. I am the divine hidden soul who creates the gods." The deceased isn't describing traveling to a place. They're describing becoming something that transcends normal causality. Something that exists across multiple time streams simultaneously. It sounds mystical, but it's remarkably similar to how quantum physicists describe quantum superposition, existing in multiple states simultaneously until observation collapses the wave function into a single reality. But the Book of the Dead goes even further. It suggests that in the afterlife, reality itself is negotiable. Remember those transformation spells? The ones that allow the deceased to become various gods, or prevent them from being transformed into animals. Egyptologists typically interpret these symbolically. The deceased wants to be like a god, so they recite a spell claiming to be that god. Simple religious metaphor. But read the spells carefully, and you realize they're not claims or wishes. They're techniques, procedures, methods for actually accomplishing transformation. Spell 76. Spell for taking any form. One wishes doesn't just say, "I want to transform." It provides a process. First, declare your current identity. Second, invoke the power that enables transformation. Third, name the form you intend to take. Fourth, speak the words of power that complete the change. It's step-by-step instruction. And it's repeated with variations throughout the Book of the Dead. Why would you need detailed procedures for something purely symbolic? Unless the procedures actually worked. Unless they produced measurable results in the realm where they were applied. Think about virtual reality for a moment. In VR, your body is completely malleable. You can be tall, short, human, non-human. You can fly, walk through walls, reshape the environment. These aren't metaphors. Within that digital space, they're real capabilities. The rules of physical reality don't apply. What if the afterlife is similar? Not in the sense of being a computer simulation, but in the sense of being a realm where consciousness exists without the constraints of physical matter. Where the rules are different and identity itself becomes fluid. The Book of the Dead would then be a manual for navigating that space, for learning to operate in a realm where thought directly shapes reality. And here's where it gets really strange. Quantum mechanics is telling us that our physical reality might actually work this way at the deepest level. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, performed multiple times since the year 2000, shows something bizarre. You can affect the past state of a particle by making a measurement in the present. Not by sending information backwards, actually altering what state the particle was in earlier. Causality at the quantum level can run backwards. The present can affect the past. Now listen to spell 30b, the spell for not letting the heart create opposition. My heart of my mother, my heart of my transformations, do not stand up against me as witness. This spell was so important that it was inscribed on heart scarabs buried with the deceased. The spell is asking the heart not to testify against the deceased during judgment. But think about the implications. If the deceased is speaking to their own heart, trying to influence what it will reveal about their past life, they're attempting to change the record of the past. Not symbolically, literally asking their heart to not create evidence of past misdeeds. In a quantum reality where observation affects state, where the present can influence the past, this isn't mystical nonsense. It's a technique for exploiting the fundamental malleability of reality. Dr. Amit Goswami, a physicist formerly at the University of Oregon, has proposed a radical interpretation. Consciousness is fundamental, and matter emerges from consciousness, not the other way around. In his model, reality is essentially a consensus experience created by conscious observation. If he's right, then after death, when individual consciousness separates from the physical body, you'd be in a realm where this reality-creating power becomes explicit and controllable. Exactly what the Book of the Dead describes. But there's another aspect of the texts that becomes even more disturbing when you understand the quantum implications. The judgment in spell 125 isn't just about moral evaluation. Look at what's actually being weighed. The heart against the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at is usually translated as truth or justice, but the Egyptian concept is more complex. Ma'at is cosmic order, balance, the fundamental structure that keeps reality stable. When your heart is weighed against Ma'at, it's not asking, were you a good person? It's asking, are you compatible with the stable structure of reality? If your heart is heavier than the feather, you're too dense, too weighted with material attachments, too bound to physical existence. You can't integrate into the subtle realm of the afterlife. So you're destroyed, recycled, fed to Amit, and returned to the primordial chaos. But if your heart balances with the feather, you achieve equilibrium. You can exist in the realm of the gods, which the texts describe as more real than physical existence, more fundamental, more lasting. It's not a moral test, it's a compatibility test. Can your consciousness exist without a physical body? Have you developed enough complexity, enough self-organization to persist in a realm of pure information? Modern information theory describes something remarkably similar. Complex information patterns can self-organize and persist. Simple patterns dissolve into entropy. The stability of an information system depends on its internal structure, not its moral qualities. The Book of the Dead might be describing a real phenomenon in terms that made sense to Bronze Age minds. But here's the most disturbing implication of all. If reality is fundamentally malleable, if consciousness can shape it, especially in the afterlife realm, then the spells in the Book of the Dead aren't just instructions for the deceased. They're potentially exploits, hacks, cheat codes for reality itself. Spell 135 allows the deceased to enter and exit the Duat at will. Spell 136 allows them to travel anywhere in the cosmos instantaneously. Spell 148 provides power over the 7 celestial cows and their bull. These aren't just prayers. They're tools for manipulating the fundamental structure of reality. And if the Egyptian priests actually developed and tested these techniques through consciousness exploration, if they actually found methods that work, then what we're looking at is something unprecedented in human history. A sophisticated technology of consciousness. One that our materialist science has dismissed as superstition for the last 2 centuries. One that we might desperately need to rediscover. Because there's evidence hidden in plain sight in museums and ignored by mainstream scholars that some Egyptian initiates actually achieved what the texts describe. They didn't just read about the afterlife. They went there, and they came back. In the collections of the British Museum, there's a papyrus that doesn't quite fit. It's catalogued as Papyrus B-MEA 10081, and it's attributed to a priest named Ankh F. Nkonsu, who lived around 680 BCE. What makes it unusual is that this priest wrote his own Book of the Dead. Not a scribe copying a traditional version. This is a personalized account. And the text contains something extraordinary. A first-person account of the journey through the Duat. Not as instruction or prayer, but as a lived experience described in past tense. Dr. Foy Scalf, a curator at the Oriental Institute, has noted that this papyrus contains unique phrasing not found in any other Book of the Dead texts. The priest describes things in active voice. I saw. I spoke to. I was transformed. It reads less like scripture and more like a travel journal. Now, mainstream Egyptology explains this as poetic license. The priest is writing as if he had made the journey, imagining what it would be like. But there's a problem with that interpretation. The priest describes details that don't appear in standard Book of the Dead templates. New obstacles, different entities, variations in procedure that wouldn't make sense unless he was reporting actual experiences that differed from the established texts. It's like reading a guidebook to Paris and then finding someone's personal travel diary that mentions restaurants and streets not listed in the guidebook. How would they know about those places unless they'd actually been there? And this isn't the only example. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there's a wooden panel from a coffin dating to around 1000 BCE. The inscriptions are unusual because they're written in first person, present tense. I am in the place between worlds. I have seen the hidden God. I have been granted the knowledge of the Akh. The Ek is the enlightened, transfigured spirit, the highest form of existence in Egyptian thought. But the text describes achieving this state while still alive, then returning to ordinary consciousness. Dr. Robert Rittner, who was a professor at the University of Chicago until his recent death, spent decades studying this and similar texts. He concluded that a subset of elite Egyptian priests actually claimed to have visited the afterlife and returned. They described these experiences as initiations, tests, proofs of their authority as priests. But the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source: the Greeks. When Greek travelers visited Egypt starting around 600 BCE, they encountered these Egyptian mystery rites, and some of them participated. Pythagoras, the famous mathematician, spent years in Egypt studying with priests. When he returned to Greece, he established his own mystery school with rituals that historians believe were directly adapted from Egyptian practices. His students wrote about initiations involving descending into darkness, symbolic death, encountering guardians who must be passed through knowledge of secret names, and emerging transformed with new understanding. Sound familiar? That's the Book of the Dead journey. Plato visited Egypt. He wrote about the experience of the soul after death in ways that closely mirror Egyptian texts. In his Republic, he includes the myth of Air, which describes a soldier who dies in battle, visits the afterlife, and returns 10 days later with a detailed account of what he saw. Scholars treat this as Plato's imagination. But what if it was Plato recounting Egyptian teachings? Teachings based on actual reported experiences. Because here's what's remarkable. The Greek accounts, the Egyptian papyri, and even modern near-death experiences reported by people who've been clinically dead and revived all describe similar elements. Darkness followed by light, a sense of leaving the body, encountering entities or presences, passing through barriers or gates, reaching a place of peace or beauty, being told it's not time and having to return. These aren't vague similarities, they're specific, detailed matches. Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience in the 1970s, has collected thousands of accounts from people who've been clinically dead. He's noted that elements of their experiences match descriptions from the Egyptian Book of the Dead with startling precision. Patients who've never studied ancient Egypt describe weighing ceremonies. They describe being asked questions by authoritative figures. They describe transformation and transcendence. In 2001, a Dutch study published in The Lancet documented 344 cardiac arrest patients who were successfully resuscitated. 18% reported near-death experiences. These patients, from various cultural backgrounds, reported consistent elements that match both each other and ancient descriptions of the afterlife journey. Now, mainstream science explains NDES as hallucinations produced by dying brains, oxygen deprivation, random neural firing, wishful thinking. But that explanation has problems. Some NDE patients report accurate information about events that occurred while they were clinically brain dead, information they couldn't have perceived through normal senses. In one famous case, documented by Dr. Michael Sabom, a patient accurately described specific medical equipment and procedures used during her operation, while her brain showed no electrical activity. Equipment she'd never seen before, procedures she couldn't have known about. How do you hallucinate accurate information about the physical world while your brain is offline? Unless consciousness can exist independent of the brain. Unless it can perceive without physical senses. unless what the Egyptians described as the journey of the soul through the duat is actually a real phenomenon that occurs when consciousness separates from the physical body. If that's true, then the Egyptian priests weren't creating mythology. They were documenting real territories, mapping actual space that consciousness enters after death. And those elite initiates who claim to have visited and returned, they might have actually done it. Through intensive training, sensory deprivation, controlled use of consciousness-altering substances, and sophisticated techniques we've lost, they might have achieved controlled near-death states, died temporarily, journeyed through the duat, and returned to report their findings. The Book of the Dead would then be a compilation of thousands of years of such reports, refined over generations, tested and verified by continuous experimentation, not faith, science, just science conducted with tools we no longer understand. And if this is true, if consciousness really does survive death, if the afterlife is a real place that can be explored and mapped, then the implications are staggering. It means death isn't the end. It means we might actually face judgment of some kind. It means our choices and character might have consequences that extend beyond our physical lifespan. It means the Egyptians were right. And it means that modern materialist science, by dismissing all of this as superstition, has thrown away knowledge that might be the most important information humanity has ever discovered. But there's one more secret in the Book of the Dead. One final revelation that changes everything we think we know about Egyptian civilization, and perhaps about human history itself. The conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization says it began around 3100 BCE when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified. Before that, there were scattered tribes and settlements. Primitive culture. Then, suddenly, almost overnight in historical terms, we get pyramids, hieroglyphs, advanced medicine, sophisticated astronomy, and the entire complex Egyptian civilization. Historians call this the sudden appearance problem. How did such advanced knowledge appear so quickly? The standard explanation is that we just haven't found the earlier evidence, that there must have been a gradual development we're missing. But what if that's not what happened? What if Egyptian civilization didn't develop gradually? What if the Egyptians inherited their knowledge from somewhere else? The Book of the Dead contains a clue that most scholars ignore because it doesn't fit conventional history. Spell 17, that long, complex spell we discussed earlier, contains a strange phrase that appears several times. This spell has been verified since the time of the followers of Horus, at the time before. The time before what? Before dynastic Egypt. Before recorded history. The text is claiming that these spells existed in an earlier era. The followers of Horus appear in multiple Egyptian texts. They're described as a lineage of priests or semi-divine beings who ruled Egypt before the Pharaohs, who taught the early Egyptians their knowledge. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as mythology, a foundational legend every culture creates for itself. But there's physical evidence that suggests otherwise. The Sphinx at Giza has vertical erosion patterns on its limestone body. Geologists have examined these patterns, and they're inconsistent with wind erosion. They're water erosion patterns, the kind caused by heavy, sustained rainfall. The last time Egypt experienced that kind of rainfall was during the African humid period, which ended around 7000 BCE. Thousands of years before Egypt supposedly had the capability to carve the Sphinx. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, has extensively studied the Sphinx. His conclusion, based purely on the geological evidence, is that the Sphinx was carved at least 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, possibly much older. Other geologists have examined his work. Some disagree with his conclusions, but they struggle to provide alternative explanations for the erosion patterns. If the Sphinx is that old, it predates Egyptian civilization by thousands of years, which means someone else built it. Some unknown culture that possessed sophisticated stoneworking technology. The Egyptians didn't build the Sphinx. They inherited it. They found it, partially buried in sand, and restored it, just like their texts claim. And if they inherited the Sphinx, what else did they inherit? Graham Hancock, a researcher who spent decades investigating ancient mysteries, has proposed a controversial theory: that an advanced civilization existed during the last ice age, before 10,000 BCE. That this civilization was destroyed by cataclysmic climate change at the end of the Ice Age, and that survivors spread across the world, bringing their knowledge to places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and South America. Mainstream archaeology dismisses this. There's no evidence, they say, of any Ice Age civilization. But what if the evidence has been hidden in plain sight? What if the Book of the Dead itself is the evidence? Think about what we've discussed. Astronomical knowledge that requires thousands of years of observation, understanding of quantum-like concepts of reality, sophisticated techniques for exploring consciousness, detailed maps of territories that consciousness encounters after death. This isn't knowledge you develop in a few generations. This is knowledge accumulated over millennia. Knowledge that requires time, resources, experimentation, and scientific methodology. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, weren't at the beginning of this knowledge tradition. They were at the end. They were preserving knowledge that was already ancient when they wrote it down. Spell 64 makes this explicit. This spell was found in the foundations beneath the shrine of the divine Henu bird in Hermopolis by a priest in the time of King Menkaure. Menkaure built the third Giza pyramid around 2500 BCE. This text is saying the spell was already ancient then, found in the foundations of an even older shrine. How old? The text doesn't say. But it suggests that the knowledge in the Book of the Dead could be thousands of years older than the oldest surviving papyri. And if that's true, if the Egyptians were preserving knowledge from a lost civilization, then the Book of the Dead isn't just about the afterlife. It's a legacy, a transmission across vast spans of time. Perhaps one of the last surviving documents from a civilization that modern history has forgotten. A civilization that understood consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence at a level we're only now beginning to rediscover. And perhaps that's the real secret scientists hide, not intentionally, but through the blind spots of their own paradigms. The possibility that human history is far older, far stranger, and far more sophisticated than we've been taught. The possibility that we're not the first advanced civilization, that others came before us, that they fell, and that they left warnings, instructions, and knowledge for those who would come after. The Book of the Dead might be one of those messages, encoded in language that survives across millennia, disguised as religious text so it would be preserved and copied, but containing within it actual technical knowledge for navigating realities beyond the physical. If that's true, then we need to look at these ancient texts with fresh eyes. Not as primitive mythology, but as sophisticated science expressed in the language available at the time. Because the answers we're seeking might not lie in the future. They might be buried in the past. So we return to where we started. Museum halls, beautiful papyri behind glass. Tour guides explaining these are religious texts from ancient Egypt. And now you know what they're not telling you. The Book of the Dead isn't simple religious poetry. It's a technical manual for navigating territories of consciousness that exist beyond physical death. It contains knowledge that shouldn't have been possible for Bronze Age priests to possess. Knowledge about the cosmos, about consciousness, about the fundamental nature of reality itself. It describes techniques that seem to have actually worked, that priests actually practiced, that produced measurable results. It preserves concepts that modern quantum physics is only now discovering. Ideas about observation creating reality, about the fluidity of identity, about consciousness existing independent of matter. And it might be the legacy of a much older civilization, one that understood these truths thousands of years before conventional history says civilization even existed. So why do scientists hide these secrets? Most don't intentionally. They're trapped in paradigms, materialist assumptions about reality, evolutionary assumptions about human history. The idea that consciousness is just an illusion produced by meat. These assumptions blind them to possibilities that the evidence actually suggests. But some scientists, the ones on the cutting edge of consciousness research and quantum physics, are starting to see what the ancient Egyptians knew. That reality is stranger than we imagine. That consciousness is fundamental. That death might not be an ending, but a transition. And that the knowledge we need for the next stage of human evolution might not come from new discoveries. It might come from remembering what we've forgotten. The ancient Egyptians spent 3,000 years preparing for death. Not because they feared it, because they understood that what came after was the real adventure, the real test, the real existence. They developed technologies of consciousness we've lost. They mapped territories we've forgotten. They left instructions that we've dismissed as superstition. But the instructions are still there, waiting in museums, hidden in plain sight. The question is, are we ready to take them seriously? Are we ready to acknowledge that our ancestors might have known things we've forgotten? That consciousness might transcend physical death. That there might be real territories to navigate after our bodies fail. Because here's the truth that the Book of the Dead keeps reminding us. Death comes for everyone. No exceptions, no escapes. And when it comes for you, what will you have prepared? The Egyptians believed that knowledge was power. That knowing the right words, the right names, the right spells could mean the difference between annihilation and eternity. Were they right? Will you face judgment? Will there be tests? Will your consciousness persist or dissolve? I don't have those answers. Neither does mainstream science, but the Egyptian priests claimed they did, and they spent thousands of years refining that knowledge. Maybe it's time we started listening. Because the greatest secret in the Book of the Dead isn't about the afterlife. It's about right now, about how we live, about understanding that consciousness is fundamental, that our choices matter, that we're part of something far larger and stranger than material existence. The Egyptians knew. They tried to tell us. They encoded it in texts that would survive millennia. The question is, will we finally hear them? Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most profound mysteries. If this video made you think, if it challenged your assumptions, if it opened your mind to possibilities you hadn't considered, do me a favor, share it. This knowledge needs to spread. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Pharaoh's Legacy, because we're just getting started. There are secrets buried in the sand of Egypt that will shake everything you thought you knew about history, about humanity, and about reality itself. The ancient Egyptians left us a message. Let's make sure it doesn't die with us. Until next time, remember, the truth is hidden, but it's waiting to be found.